So today we're going to talk about the idea that Newton is the man that developed the amazing system and laws that we still use. And we're going to focus in particular in the God and the universe section, so make sure you have that out. So I think basically what we're trying to ask is whether his ideas of God and science are completely different in this reading.
The most important idea that Newton kind of brought to the table during the scientific revolution was the the unity of God and the universe, and just the idea that they could live in coexistence. And what I think he's talking about is that you can believe in God in a less spiritual way. You don't have to it's not as much of a spiritual being, but also it can be interpreted in a scientific way, how there is a God and science allows for there to be a God.
Although he's a scientist, he's saying science doesn't really apply when it comes to God, and that the human senses can't really observe God. God cannot be seen, heard, or felt. And so although he's a scientist, admitting that that sciences and maths don't apply to this is just really interesting for his time. Yeah?
Well, I know this is the person that we had to compare him to, but he sounds like Thomas Aquinas when he talks about God, because he's saying he's not really justifying his proof. So he's saying there is a God, but God is everywhere, so we can't see God, and that's why you can't see God, because God is everything and God is everywhere. And so I think at that point he goes into just kind of assuming things instead of actually observing, because if he had observed, he wouldn't be able to see God. But that in itself is his own justification for the proof of God.
Well, at the same time, I do agree with what Theo was saying, but at the same time, he is being inductive, because the part where he talks about the blind man, he's saying that they can't really tell the way God works, like they need to observe him at the same time. So he is being deductive by saying there is a God, but the way that he sort of views God is inductive.
Great. Can I play devil's advocate for a second, though? I actually think they're really similar. That Newton already knows that God exists, and then has evidence that he then puts forth that proves what he already knows. And it's very similar to that scholasticism. Did anybody else see that? And when he says that he actually says God does belong to natural philosophy and science, that it's all the same thing. Thoughts?
Jordan?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that both Newton and Aquinas sort of merged scientific belief and belief in God.
I agree. I think that Aquinas really, he came to the conclusions before he had really thought about it, and then used all the things that he had learned about before to back up his, I guess he has a little more proof, not of God, but of other scientific things than Aquinas, but he uses more specificity in his justification.
Does atheism come with modernity and science? And do you think that there was such a thing as atheism at the time?
I guess if we look towards the general trend of everything we've studied in history this far, we see that back when we were studying ancient India, there was really no concept of secularism or atheism or not being religious. It was such an integral part of life and society back then. And I guess moving on to the Enlightenment and to the Renaissance, we see these ideas emerging. I don't think that today necessarily atheism and modernity go hand in hand, but just looking at the past 1,000 years or 1,000+ years that we've been studying, I see a general trend in that direction.
I guess atheism doesn't exactly become more prevalent, but it definitely, I think science is definitely filling in blanks that used to exist. For example, the shift between someone like Thomas Aquinas' ideas and Newton's ideas. Thomas Aquinas definitely had a lot of, he jumped to a lot of conclusions because there wasn't scientific evidence yet, or that he couldn't find scientific evidence to prove the existence of God. And then when Newton comes in, he has all these ideas that kind of fill in all of these blanks that used to be just that the causes of which were attributed to God. And I guess when Newton fills in the blanks that used to be attributed to some divine force, it doesn't, I guess, support atheism anymore, or it doesn't really support atheism, but at the same time it definitely migrates away from an original idea of just divine like interpretation of the universe. And so ultimately, I think as time goes on, science takes the position, takes, I guess, positions that used to be filled by religious idea. And so it's kind of navigating away from strictly religious interpretation. And I think eventually, once more and more blanks are filled, that's going to end up flowing into one big idea of atheism, where everything is kind of explained, and so you can't really attribute anything to it like a divine force.
Great. I mean, I think what's great about the conversation that you all just had is that historians have the exact same debate. So the question is, when did atheism first arise? And some historians say, well, there have always been people who didn't believe in God, but they didn't call themselves atheists. It's basically what you said, Theo, that really to have a real atheist, they have to have the vocabulary of atheism, right? And that comes with the Enlightenment, which will start tomorrow. But it's interesting that you were able to replicate the debate that they had without knowing what it is. You're done?
I think so.